A millionaire's fiancé humiliated his disabled daughter in front of everyone, calling her a burden and treating her like she didn't belong. At first, he said nothing, but what he did next left the entire room speechless. Because behind his silence was a plan, one that would not only expose her cruelty, but prove just how far a father would go to protect the child he nearly lost. How did a moment of cruelty uncover years of hidden pain and lead to a decision that would change all their lives forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning light crept through the windows of the Carrington estate, casting long shadows across polished hardwood floors. Ethan stirred in his bed, awakened not by his alarm, but by the gentle whisper of wind through untamed branches outside. His eyes opened slowly, taking in the familiar sight of his bedroom ceiling. The date on his bedside clock made his chest tighten. May 15th, 5 years to the day. He could hear the rustling leaves of the garden through his partially open window. The sound brought memories of Eliza's laughter as she'd worked among her beloved roses, teaching Mia which flowers needed more sun and which preferred shade. Now those same plants grew wild and unkempt, a reflection of the chaos he still felt inside. The soft mechanical whir of Mia's wheelchair pulled him from his thoughts. The sound moved steadily down the hallway, accompanied by the quiet squeak of well-worn wheels. Ethan pushed himself up, running a hand through his graying hair. He needed to oil those wheels again soon. In the kitchen, morning sunlight poured through large windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Mia was already at her usual spot at the breakfast table, her small hands busy with a sheet of bright yellow paper. Her movements were precise and practiced as she folded it with careful attention. "Morning, sweetheart," Ethan said, his voice still rough with sleep. He received a small nod in response, Mia's eyes never leaving her paper crane in progress. He moved to the refrigerator, his actions automatic after years of the same routine. Eggs cracked into a bowl, toast in the toaster, coffee grounds measured precisely. Each motion was mechanical, performed without thought or joy. The kitchen felt too quiet, too empty without Eliza's morning humming or the classical music she used to play. At the table, Mia's fingers worked steadily, creasing and folding. The yellow paper gradually took shape, transforming into a delicate crane. It was their morning ritual, one she'd started shortly after the funeral. One crane each morning, just like Eliza had taught her. Ethan watched from the corner of his eye as she placed it carefully beside her plate, adjusting its wings until they were perfectly balanced. "Would you like to visit Mom's garden today?" he asked, setting a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her. The question was part of their anniversary ritual, though they both knew what would follow. Mia nodded, her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, meeting his briefly before returning to her breakfast. She took small, careful bites, while Ethan's own food remained mostly untouched on his plate. After breakfast, they made their way outside to the living lantern. The garden path, once neatly maintained with crushed shells that made it easy for Mia's wheelchair, was now scattered and overgrown. Ethan had to push harder to help her navigate the uneven ground. The garden itself was a shadow of its former glory. Eliza had designed it as a sanctuary, a place where their daughter could experience nature without barriers. Now, weeds choked the raised beds she'd built at wheelchair height. The arbors she'd constructed for climbing roses sagged under the weight of untamed vines. Yet somehow, despite the neglect, some of Eliza's roses still bloomed, their pink petals bright against the tangled green. Mia reached out toward one of the roses, her small face intent with concentration. Before Ethan could warn her, her finger caught on a hidden thorn. She pulled back with a small gasp of pain. "Mia!" Ethan rushed forward, grabbing her hand to inspect the tiny wound. A small drop of blood welled up on her finger. His heart raced as he pulled out a handkerchief, pressing it against the prick. "We should go inside, clean this properly." "Dad?" Mia's quiet voice stopped him. "It's just a little scratch." Her words were gentle but firm, so much like her mother's tone that it made his throat tight. Ethan forced himself to take a deep breath to loosen his grip on her hand. He knew he was overreacting, knew that his fear of losing her too made him sometimes smother her with protection. "You're right," he managed, "but let's still put a bandage on it inside." "Could we fix the garden?" Mia asked as he turned her wheelchair around. "Make it nice again?" Ethan looked back at the overgrown space, seeing both what it was and what it had been. The thought of working in Eliza's garden without her made his chest ache. "Soon," he said, the same answer he'd given for the past 5 years. "We'll fix it up soon." That evening, after a quiet dinner of reheated lasagna, Ethan sat at his desk sorting through mail. Mia was in the living room, the soft scratch of her colored pencils against paper the only sound in the house. The lamp beside her cast a warm circle of light around her wheelchair, making her look small in the dimness of the large room. Among the bills and advertisements, a cream-colored envelope caught his attention. The paper was thick, expensive. Inside was an invitation to a charity art auction, benefiting children's therapy centers across the state. His first instinct was to toss it aside. He'd avoided most social events since Eliza's passing, preferring to lose himself in work instead. But something made him pause. He looked over at Mia, watching as she carefully colored within the lines of her drawing. She was so often alone, he realized, just like him, existing in their quiet routine of grief and unspoken memories. The invitation sat heavy in his hands. He placed it carefully on his desk, separate from the pile of discarded mail. Not a yes, but not a no either. Just a possibility, sitting there like a seed waiting to be planted. 2 days after receiving the invitation, Ethan stood before his bedroom mirror, fumbling with a dark blue tie. The suit felt stiff and foreign after years of casual clothes or business casual work attire. He couldn't remember the last time he'd dressed formally for anything other than a client meeting. The soft whir of Mia's wheelchair approached his door. She appeared in the doorway, holding 3 ties she'd collected from his closet. "The blue one's wrong," she said matter-of-factly, studying his reflection. "It's too serious." Ethan looked down at his daughter, her small face tilted up with careful consideration. "Too serious?" he asked, already loosening the knot. "I thought serious was appropriate for a charity event." Mia shook her head, sorting through her selection. She pulled out a burgundy tie with tiny silver dots that caught the light. "This one," she decided, holding it up. "Mom always said you looked happy in red." The mention of Eliza made Ethan's hands pause for just a moment as he took the tie from Mia. She was right, of course. Eliza had bought him this tie, insisting that he needed more color in his wardrobe. He looped it around his neck, the familiar motions coming back to him slowly. "Here," Mia said, wheeling closer. "You're making it crooked." Her small fingers reached up to adjust the knot with surprising dexterity. Ethan had to bend down slightly to let her reach, and the gesture reminded him painfully of how Eliza used to do the same thing. When she finished, Ethan straightened and looked in the mirror again. The burgundy did add a warmth to his appearance that the blue had lacked. "Perfect," he admitted, managing a small smile for her benefit. Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor who often watched Mia, had already arrived and was waiting downstairs. Ethan checked his watch. He was running late, as usual. "I won't be long," he said, reaching for his wallet and keys. Mia's dark eyes met his in the mirror. "Take your time," she said with that startling maturity that sometimes emerged from her. "You should smile today." The simple statement hit him like a physical touch. He swallowed hard, pretending to adjust his tie again to hide his reaction. Sometimes Mia's perception cut too close to home, revealing truths he wasn't ready to face. The charity auction was held in a converted warehouse space downtown, its industrial architecture softened by strategic lighting and elegant decorations. String lights crisscrossed the high ceiling, casting a warm glow over the crowd below. The space buzzed with conversation and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses. Ethan kept to the edges of the room, nursing a single glass of wine. He watched as people moved between the displayed artworks, making notes in their programs, and engaging in animated discussions about technique and meaning. He felt out of place among their easy social grace, like a book shelved in the wrong section of a library. His aimless wandering brought him to a quieter corner of the gallery. There, hanging on an exposed brick wall, was a painting that made him stop mid-step. It depicted a cascade of paper cranes, each one rendered in exquisite detail. They seemed to float across the canvas, some in sharp focus while others faded into soft suggestions of form. The colors shifted from deep blues to warm golds, creating an impression of movement and light. Ethan moved closer, drawn by the familiar shapes that reminded him so much of Mia's morning ritual. The title card read, "1,000 Wishes," by an artist he didn't recognize. He was reaching for his program to mark down the lot number when a voice spoke beside him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" He turned to find a woman standing there, elegant in a black dress that seemed to catch and hold the light. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it, and her smile held a knowing warmth that made it difficult to look away. "The symbolism of cranes has always fascinated me," she continued, stepping closer to the painting. "There's something powerful about how they appear so delicate, yet they're actually quite resilient." She turned to face him, extending her hand. "I'm Lila Renner." "Ethan Carrington," he replied, shaking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm and confident. "The architect?" Her eyes lit with recognition. "I've admired your work on the Children's Hospital wing. The way you incorporated natural light and healing spaces. It was inspired." Something in her genuine appreciation made him lower his guard slightly. "That was a while ago," he said, looking back at the painting. "I stick to commercial projects now." "That's a shame," Lila said softly. "Those healing spaces you created, they were more than just buildings. They gave hope to people who needed it most." She paused, studying his profile. "Like these cranes, sometimes the most fragile things hold the most strength." The parallel hit too close to home, reminding him of Mia's quiet determination each morning as she folded her papers. He found himself saying, "My daughter makes them." Crane. One every morning. "Really?" Lila's interest seemed genuine. "That's quite a dedication for a child. How many has she made?" 1,825, Ethan answered without hesitation. "One for each day since—" He stopped, surprised at himself for revealing so much to a stranger. Lila didn't press for the rest of the sentence. Instead, she gestured to the painting. "Then perhaps this belongs with her. The bidding starts in a few minutes." When Ethan returned home late that night, the house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He found Mia asleep in her wheelchair by the living room window, her head tilted to one side, a half-finished drawing still in her lap. The moonlight silvered her dark hair, making her look even smaller than usual. He walked past her toward the stairs, the wrapped painting tucked under his arm. Then he stopped, turned back. Setting the painting carefully against the wall, he retrieved a soft throw blanket from the couch. With gentle movements, he draped it over her sleeping form, tucking it around her shoulders the way Eliza used to do. Picking up the painting again, he made his way upstairs to Mia's room. The walls were already decorated with her own artwork. Drawings of gardens, birds, and countless paper cranes hung in neat rows. He propped the painting against her desk where the morning light would hit it first, where she would see it when she woke up to fold her next crane. The evening air held a hint of autumn as Ethan waited outside the downtown gallery. His fingers drummed against his phone screen, checking the time and his messages for the 5th time in as many minutes. A text from Mrs. Peterson, Mia's nurse, lit up the display. "All good here. She's finishing her history homework." The gallery doors opened, spilling warm light onto the sidewalk as people began filtering out. Lila emerged last, her silver dress catching the streetlights. She spotted Ethan and walked over with that confident stride he'd come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, reaching up to kiss his cheek. "The closing took longer than expected. Shall we?" They walked to a nearby restaurant, one of the quiet, upscale places Lila preferred. As they settled into their booth, Ethan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it automatically. Another update from Mrs. Peterson about Mia's evening routine. Lila watched him, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "You know," she said, reaching across to lower his phone gently, "I've never seen someone quite so attached to their device. Even during our coffee date yesterday, you checked it at least a dozen times. Ethan felt heat rise to his face. I'm sorry, it's just… The nurse's updates about Mia, Lila finished for him. She took a sip of the wine the server had just poured. You're a good dad, Ethan. Too good, actually. You need a little selfishness in your life. The words made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. Mia needs a father who takes care of himself too, Lila interrupted smoothly. When was the last time you did something just for you? Something that didn't revolve around being a parent. The question hung in the air, and Ethan realized he couldn't remember. Even these dates with Lila had started because of that charity auction for children's therapy centers. 3 days later, Ethan led Lila through the door of the Sweet Bean Cafe, a casual place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Mia was already there with Mrs. Peterson, settled at a corner table near the window. Sunlight streamed in, highlighting the origami crane she was working on while she waited. Mia, Ethan called softly. She looked up, her fingers stilling on the half-folded paper. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Lila stepped forward, crouching down beside Mia's wheelchair. Her voice rose several notches, taking on an exaggerated brightness. Hi there. You must be Mia. Your daddy's told me so much about you. Mia's hands carefully smoothed the paper crane's wings. Hello, she said quietly, her eyes moving between Lila and her father. Oh, look at you making those lovely paper birds, Lila exclaimed, her voice carrying across the cafe. Several other patrons glanced their way. And you're so brave, coming out to meet me like this in your wheelchair, just wonderful. Ethan watched as Mia's fingers tightened slightly on the paper crane. She nodded politely but said nothing more. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the tension, suggested they order some hot chocolate. Throughout the meeting, Lila maintained her overly enthusiastic demeanor, speaking to Mia in that same loud, bright voice. She kept touching Mia's shoulder, leaning in close, and making comments about how special it was to meet such an inspiring young girl. Mia remained quiet, responding with short answers and small nods. She didn't finish her crane, leaving it half-folded beside her untouched hot chocolate. Ethan attributed her reserved behavior to nervousness about meeting someone new. After all, it had been just the two of them for so long. The drive home was silent, but that wasn't unusual. Mia often got tired after outings, and Ethan assumed she was processing the new experience. As he helped her out of the car, she finally spoke. Do you like her? The question was simple, direct, typical Mia. Ethan paused, considering his answer carefully. I think I could, he said finally, watching her face for a reaction. Mia nodded, her expression unreadable. She wheeled herself inside without another word, leaving Ethan to wonder if he'd said the right thing. That evening, after dinner and homework, Mia sat at her desk where the crane painting hung. The moonlight filtered through her window, casting shadows across the canvas. She reached for a sheet of paper. Not the special origami paper she usually used, but a plain white sheet from her school notebook. Her fingers moved through the familiar folds, but something was different. The creases weren't as sharp as usual, the corners not quite aligned. When she finished, the crane's wings were slightly crumpled, uneven in a way her cranes never were. She held it up to the moonlight, studying its imperfect silhouette. Then, without writing a date or wish on its wing as she always did, she placed it carefully near the painting of floating cranes. The crumpled crane sat there, a stark contrast to its perfect painted counterparts, its crooked wings catching shadows in the dim light. The late September evening cast long shadows across the estate's manicured lawn as cars pulled up the circular driveway. Ethan adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, checking his reflection one last time before guests arrived for the foundation dinner. The sound of Mia's wheelchair made him turn, the familiar soft whir bringing a smile to his face despite his nerves. Are you sure you want to stay for the whole thing? He asked gently. It might run late, past your bedtime even. His eyes crinkled with concern. Mia smoothed the fabric of her dress, a pale blue piece with silver threading that Eliza had bought for her last birthday. The hem now sat above her ankles, but she'd insisted on wearing it. I'm sure, Dad. she said, her chin lifted with quiet determination. Her small fingers traced the delicate silver patterns that caught the light. Ethan knelt beside her wheelchair, noticing how the dress seemed to catch the light just as Eliza had said it would. The fabric shimmered with each of Mia's movements, like stars winking in and out. Mom always knew best about clothes, didn't she? His voice softened at the edges. A small smile touched Mia's lips, transforming her solemn face. She said this one had starlight in it. She twirled a loose strand of hair around her finger, a habit she'd picked up from Eliza. The doorbell chimed and Ethan squeezed her hand before standing. Ready to help me host? He straightened his shoulders, preparing himself for the evening ahead. The grand dining room slowly filled with foundation donors and board members, their conversations creating a steady hum beneath the crystal chandelier that had been Eliza's pride and joy. Lila arrived fashionably late, turning heads in an elegant black dress that hugged her figure perfectly. She kissed Ethan's cheek and gave Mia a practiced smile before gliding away to mingle, her perfume lingering in the air between them. Mia wheeled carefully between the tables, trying to navigate the narrow spaces between chairs. Several guests shifted automatically to make room, offering kind smiles, but others remained oblivious, deep in conversation about stock portfolios and vacation homes. The catering staff worked around her, serving appetizers and filling wine glasses with practiced efficiency. Near the center table, Mia attempted to turn between two closely set chairs. Her wheel caught on a table leg, and as she tried to reverse, her elbow bumped a full wine glass. The red liquid splashed across the white tablecloth like spilled paint, the glass toppling with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the room. The room fell silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence and all eyes turned toward the sound. Before Ethan could move, Lila was there, crouching beside Mia's wheelchair. Her smile was tight, practiced, but her eyes were cold as winter frost. She leaned close, her voice a harsh whisper that carried in the quiet room. "This place isn't made for you. You ruin the room just by being in it." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Mia's hands gripped her armrests, her knuckles turning white, her face draining of color. She looked up, finding her father standing just feet away. Their eyes met, and Ethan saw the confusion and hurt bloom across his daughter's face like a bruise. For a moment he stood frozen, the weight of Lila's words hanging in the air between them. Then he moved forward, his voice steady but gentle. "It's okay, kiddo. Let's go outside for air." He placed himself between Mia and Lila, a silent shield of protection. The dinner continued without them. Ethan and Mia sat in the garden entrance, watching fireflies dance among the overgrown roses. Neither spoke about what had happened, but Ethan's hand remained on Mia's shoulder, steady and present, his thumb making small circles of comfort. Later, after the last car had disappeared down the driveway and the house had fallen silent, Ethan found himself walking toward the living lantern. The garden looked different in the darkness, its wild tangles softened by moonlight. A light drizzle had started, creating a soft patter among the leaves like whispered secrets. Something white caught his eye. One of Mia's paper cranes had blown out here, probably carried by the evening breeze. He picked it up carefully, the wet paper fragile in his hands. Water had seeped into the creases, distorting the careful folds until they barely held their shape, the bird's proud neck now drooping. Standing there holding the sodden crane, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried for 5 years seemed to crystallize into a single clear thought. It settled in his chest with unexpected lightness. "It's time," he whispered to the garden, to the memory of Eliza, to himself. The words felt right on his lips, like a promise too long delayed. Back in his study, Ethan pulled out his drafting table, untouched since before Eliza's passing. He switched on the lamp, its warm light falling across the blank paper like a blessing. His hand moved with surprising sureness, sketching the first lines of the living lantern's restoration. It was his first design in years, but the pencil felt familiar, like returning to a language he'd never truly forgotten. The blueprint began to take shape under his hands. Paths wide enough for Mia's wheelchair, raised beds she could tend from her seat, a central area where paper cranes could hang safely from rainproof lines. In the corner of the page, he sketched a small note. For M and E. His heart felt lighter than it had in years, as if by drawing these lines, he was finding his way back to something essential. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. Ethan moved through his breakfast routine with mechanical precision, cracking eggs into a pan while the coffee maker hummed softly in the background. At the kitchen table, Mia worked on her morning crane, her small fingers less sure than usual. The paper refused to cooperate, creating sharp, uneven edges where there should have been smooth folds. The silence between them felt heavy, laden with unspoken words from the previous night's dinner. Ethan glanced at his daughter over his shoulder, noting how her shoulders hunched slightly as she worked. The crane was taking shape, but it looked different from her usual precise creations. This one seemed to carry the weight of her emotions in its crooked wings and misaligned folds. He placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, then sat down with his own breakfast. Neither touched their food immediately. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed unusually loud. "What did she say to you last night?" Ethan finally asked, his voice soft but firm. Mia's hand stilled on the paper crane. She didn't look up, but her response carried a wisdom beyond her years. Nothing new. Just louder. The simplicity of her answer made Ethan's chest tighten. He reached across the table and gently touched her hand, but words failed him. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Ethan found himself unable to focus on work. His laptop remained closed on his desk while he wandered the sprawling grounds of the estate. The blueprint he'd sketched the night before was folded carefully in his pocket, and he found himself pulling it out repeatedly, studying the lines and measurements he'd drawn in that moment of clarity. The living lantern looked different in daylight. Where he'd once seen only decay and painful memories, he now noticed possibilities. The sturdy bones of the garden remained beneath the overgrowth, the stone pathways, the solid wooden arbors, the carefully planned beds that Eliza had loved so much. Without conscious decision, he found himself pulling on work gloves and beginning to clear away dead branches. The physical labor felt good, grounding. Each piece of debris he removed revealed more of the garden's original structure. When Mia returned from school, she found him knee-deep in fallen leaves and tangled vines. She watched him work for a moment, then wheeled herself closer to the garden's entrance. Without a word, she reached into her backpack and pulled out the morning's crane. She stretched forward in her wheelchair and placed it carefully in the empty birdbath, its jagged wings catching the afternoon light. Ethan paused his work, wiping sweat from his forehead as he watched her. They shared a look of understanding, and then Mia began pointing out areas where the path needed clearing to accommodate her wheelchair. As evening approached, Ethan sent Mia inside with her nurse while he implemented the next phase of his plan. His fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen as he typed a message to Lila. Private dinner. Just us. 8 p.m. The garden. For the next several hours, he worked with focused determination. He hung delicate paper lanterns from the arbors and tree branches, their soft light creating a magical atmosphere as dusk settled. From carefully preserved boxes in the garden shed, he retrieved all 1,000 paper cranes that Mia had folded over the years since Eliza's passing. Each one held a memory, a moment of grief or hope captured in creased paper. He arranged them on strings between the trees, creating a pathway that led to a small table set beneath Eliza's favorite cherry blossom tree. Though the tree wasn't in bloom, its graceful branches created a natural canopy above the intimate setting. He didn't tell Mia what he was preparing for. This moment needed to be private. At exactly 8 o'clock, the crunch of gravel announced Lila's arrival. She emerged from her car looking elegant and expectant, her eyes lighting up at the romantic setting. Ethan could see the assumption in her smile. She thought this was leading to a proposal. He met her at the garden's entrance, taking her hand formally. "I want to show you something," he said quietly, leading her down the illuminated path. The paper cranes swayed gently in the evening breeze, their shadows dancing on the ground. "This one," he said, pointing to a slightly crushed crane near the beginning of the path, "Mia made the day after the funeral. She could barely fold the paper through her tears, but she insisted on making one every day, just like she'd promised her mother. They moved further along the path. This blue one, she folded it the first day she went back to school, and this yellow one was from the morning she finally learned to maneuver her wheelchair by herself. Lila's smile had begun to fade as understanding dawned in her eyes. Still, Ethan continued, his voice remaining calm and steady. Each of these cranes carries a piece of our story, how we survived, how we kept going. Mia made them as a bridge between her mother's memory and her hope for the future. When I was lost in grief, these paper birds were sometimes the only thing that reminded me to keep breathing. They reached the table under the cherry tree. Ethan turned to face Lila directly, his expression gentle but resolute. You saw my daughter as a burden, but she is the only reason I survived losing her mother. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a check, holding it out to her. Thank you for the illusion of love. You won't be part of our story. Lila stared at the check, then at the cranes surrounding them. Her face hardened into a mask of controlled anger, but she said nothing. Taking the check, she turned on her heel and walked briskly back down the path, her heels clicking sharply against the stone until she disappeared into the darkness beyond the garden. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethan woke to an unusually quiet house. No sound of wheelchair motors or rustling paper filled the halls. His heart quickened for a moment until he glanced out his bedroom window and spotted a small figure in the garden below. Mia was already hard at work, her wheelchair parked beside a flower bed as she leaned forward, tiny gloved hands pulling at stubborn weeds. Her determination was visible even from a distance, reminding him so much of Eliza that his chest tightened. He quickly dressed and made his way outside, the dewy grass soaking the hem of his pajama pants. As he approached, Mia didn't look up from her task, but her shoulders straightened slightly, acknowledging his presence. Her gardening gloves were too big, sliding off her wrists as she worked, but she kept adjusting them with patient persistence. Did you break up with her? Mia asked directly, still focused on a particularly stubborn dandelion. Ethan knelt beside her in the damp earth, reaching out to help with the weed. Their hands worked together, pulling gently until the root came free. Yes, he answered simply. Mia nodded, brushing dirt from her gloves. Good, she said, her voice carrying a hint of relief. She never folded any cranes. The truth in those words hung between them, more significant than any adult explanation could have been. Ethan smiled softly, understanding that his daughter had seen what he'd taken weeks to realize. Throughout the week that followed, the living lantern slowly began to transform. Each day after school, Mia would race home, eager to continue their work. Ethan adjusted his schedule, moving meetings to early mornings or late evenings, preserving their afternoon garden time. As they worked side by side, memories of Eliza began to flow naturally into their conversations. While repainting a weathered bench in soft blue, Eliza's favorite color, Ethan told Mia about their first date, how her mother had worn a dress that exact shade. She spilled coffee all over it, he recalled, carefully brushing paint along the bench's arm. But instead of being upset, she just laughed and said it gave the dress character. Mia giggled, dabbing her brush against a stubborn spot. Mom always said mistakes made things interesting. That she did, Ethan agreed, watching as his daughter meticulously painted her section of the bench. Her strokes were careful, deliberate, just like everything else she did. They planted new flowers in the newly cleared beds, bright zinnias, gentle lavender, and climbing jasmine that would eventually wind its way up the restored trellises. Each plant was chosen with purpose, either because Eliza had loved it or because Mia had picked it from the garden center's catalog, explaining exactly why it belonged in their garden. One afternoon, while Ethan was securing wind chimes to the branches of an old oak tree, delicate copper tubes that Eliza had bought years ago but never hung, Mia disappeared into the house. She returned clutching a worn shoebox to her chest, her expression both nervous and excited. I have something to show you, she said, waiting for him to climb down from the ladder. Ethan settled beside her wheelchair as she carefully removed the lid. Inside lay sheets of pristine origami paper, still wrapped in their original packaging. The top layer shimmered with metallic gold, catching the sunlight and throwing tiny reflections across their faces. I was waiting to feel something before I used the gold ones, Mia explained softly, running her fingers along the edge of the paper. Mom always said gold was for special occasions. Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them back. "What do you feel now?" he asked gently. Mia looked around at their half-restored garden, at the freshly painted bench and the swaying wind chimes that filled the air with gentle music. "I feel like Mom would be happy," she said. "Like maybe we're ready." "Then it's time," Ethan replied, helping her remove the golden paper from its wrapper. They worked together as evening approached, Mia guiding his larger hands through the familiar folds. His creases were clumsy compared to hers, but she showed remarkable patience, demonstrating each step multiple times until they created their first golden crane together. It wasn't perfect. One wing was slightly more creased than the other and the head was a bit crooked, but Mia beamed at it as if it were the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. They were about to hang it among its paper siblings when the crunch of tires on gravel caught their attention. Through the garden's wrought iron gates, they could see a car had pulled up. A woman stepped out, her silhouette uncertain in the growing dusk. She stood still, making no move to enter, but they could see something clutched in her hand. One of Mia's paper cranes, its wings catching the light from the newly hung lanterns. The woman remained at the gate, her gaze fixed on the garden where hundreds of paper cranes swayed gently in the evening breeze. The lanterns cast soft, dancing shadows across the restored paths and freshly planted flowers. After a long moment of silence, her voice carried softly through the quiet air. "Did a little girl make these?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the iron gate latch. The woman stood quietly, patient and unassuming, holding one of Mia's paper cranes with a gentleness that caught his attention. Her posture was careful, almost protective of the delicate creation in her hands. He pushed the gate open slowly, its hinges creaking softly in the evening air. The woman took a small step forward, but maintained a respectful distance. She wore simple clothes, a soft blue cardigan and dark pants, and carried herself with a quiet grace that seemed to match the peaceful atmosphere of the garden. "I'm Nora Hale," she introduced herself, her voice warm but measured. "I work as a trauma counselor and art therapist at the children's clinic downtown." She held up the crane with careful fingers. "This was part of a collection we submitted anonymously to the national exhibition. The gallery hosting the charity auction displayed it." The paper crane in her hands was one of Mia's earlier ones, slightly uneven but made with obvious care. The corners were worn soft from handling, suggesting it had been touched and studied many times. From behind Ethan, the familiar sound of motorized wheels approached. Mia rolled forward, her eyes fixed on the crane in Nora's hands. She stopped beside her father, head tilted slightly as she studied their visitor. "Did you like it?" Mia asked directly, her small hands folded in her lap. Nora didn't hesitate. She knelt down beside Mia's wheelchair, bringing herself to eye level with the young girl. There was nothing condescending in her movement, just a natural adjustment to make conversation more comfortable. Her eyes met Mia's with genuine warmth. "It made me feel safe in a way I haven't in years," Nora replied softly, her words carrying the weight of truth. She carefully held out the crane, letting Mia see how she'd been holding it. "The way you folded each crease, it felt like someone understanding without words." Ethan watched the interaction, noting how Nora spoke to Mia as a person, not a child to be coddled or a condition to be managed. The evening air had grown cooler, and the lanterns cast warm, flickering light across the garden paths. "Would you like some tea?" he found himself offering, surprising himself with how natural the invitation felt. "We just hung these wind chimes today. They sound nicest at sunset." Nora smiled, standing slowly. "I'd like that very much, thank you." They settled at the newly painted blue bench, Mia positioning her wheelchair at one end while Ethan brought out a tray with tea. The wind chimes sang softly above them, their gentle notes mixing with the evening bird song. As Nora accepted her cup, her eyes traveled over the garden, taking in the fresh plantings, the hanging cranes, the areas still waiting to be restored. Her gaze lingered on certain details: the careful placement of the lanterns, the deliberate arrangement of the paper cranes, the way some areas seemed more recently tended than others. You know, she said after a thoughtful sip of tea, I used to work with someone named Lila years ago. Her voice carried no judgment, just a quiet recognition. At the clinic, she was angry, always running from something. Ethan's hands tightened slightly around his cup, but he remained silent, listening. She refused to fold even a single crane, Nora continued, watching a nearby lantern sway in the breeze. Said paper couldn't hold pain. She shook her head slightly, as if at a memory. But that's not true, is it? Paper holds whatever we trust it with, pain, hope, memory, sometimes all at once. Mia, who had been quietly folding the edges of her napkin, looked up at Nora with curious eyes. Did you help her? She asked, her voice carrying that direct simplicity children sometimes have when asking the most complex questions. Nora's expression softened, touched by the genuine concern in Mia's question. She set her teacup down carefully before answering. She left before she gave anyone the chance, she replied quietly. Sometimes people aren't ready to let others help them heal. They have to want it first. The words settled in the garden air, mixing with the gentle chiming above them. No one spoke for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, as the sky slowly darkened and the lantern's light grew stronger. As the evening drew to a close, Nora stood from the bench, brushing off her pants with careful movements. She walked a few steps to where one of the paper cranes hung from a low branch, its wings catching the lantern light. With gentle fingers, she touched the crane, watching it spin slowly. Turning back to face Ethan and Mia, her expression held something warm and hopeful. If you ever need help finishing the garden, she said, gesturing to the areas still waiting to be restored, I'd like to come back. Ethan looked at Mia, who was already nodding, then back to Nora. The lantern light caught the gold crane they had folded together earlier, making it shine like a beacon among its white paper siblings. We'd like that, he said simply, meaning every word. 2 days passed like a gentle breeze through the garden before Nora returned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly cleared paths as she approached the gate, carrying a canvas bag filled with gardening tools. She wore practical clothes, faded jeans and a loose cotton shirt, with her hair tied back in a simple knot. In her hands, she held a carefully crafted paper crane, its wings detailed with intricate folds that caught the light. Ethan and Mia were already in the garden, preparing a new bed for white lilies. Mia's wheelchair had special attachments that allowed her to reach the soil without straining, and her small hands were covered in child-sized gardening gloves patterned with butterflies. Ethan knelt beside her, showing her how to measure the proper spacing between bulbs. Good morning, Nora called softly, not wanting to startle them. She held up her supplies with a smile. I brought reinforcements. Mia's face brightened at the sight of the new crane in Nora's hands. You made one, she exclaimed, wheeling closer to examine it. I did, Nora nodded, carefully passing it to Mia. I thought the garden could use one more friend. Ethan stood, brushing soil from his knees, and walked over to welcome her. We're just starting the lily bed, he explained, gesturing to the cleared earth. Eliza always wanted white lilies here. Nora pulled on her gardening gloves and joined them at the flower bed. The three worked in comfortable silence for a while, with only the sound of birds and rustling leaves between them. The rhythm of their movements fell into an easy synchronization, Ethan digging the holes, Nora preparing the bulbs, and Mia carefully placing each one in its new home. After they'd planted several rows, Mia looked up at Nora, her eyes curious but gentle. What made you want to come back? She asked, her voice carrying that direct honesty children often possess. Nora's hands stilled in the soil. She took a deep breath as if gathering courage from the garden air around them. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. A few years ago, I couldn't leave my house, she began, carefully patting soil around a bulb. Something bad happened. Someone hurt me. And afterward, I was too scared to go outside. Even opening my windows felt dangerous. Ethan's movement slowed, his attention caught by the quiet strength in her voice. Mia watched Nora with understanding beyond her years, her small hands still in her lap. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, Nora continued, her fingers tracing patterns in the loose soil. During panic attacks, when everything felt like it was spinning out of control, folding paper was the only thing that helped. The precise creases, the familiar patterns. They gave me something to focus on, something I could control. She reached for another lily bulb, her movements deliberate and careful. Each crane I folded was like taking back a piece of myself. They became my way of measuring progress. On days I could fold 10 cranes, I knew I was stronger. On days I could only manage one, I knew that was okay too. Mia wheeled closer to Nora, their shoulders nearly touching. "Did you make 1,000?" she asked softly. Nora smiled, a gentle expression that reached her eyes. "I did. And when I finished the last one, I opened my front door and walked outside for the first time in months." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the trees onto their small group. Ethan watched as Nora reached into her bag and pulled out a sheet of special origami paper, its surface shimmering with intricate patterns. "Would you like to learn something new?" she asked Mia, holding out the paper. "This is how to make a crane with multiple wings. It's trickier than the regular ones, but sometimes the hardest folds make the most beautiful shapes." Mia's eyes lit up with interest. She positioned her wheelchair at the garden table where they'd set up their tools. Ethan stepped back, moving to work on another section of the garden, but his eyes kept returning to the pair at the table. Nora's hands moved with practiced grace as she demonstrated each fold, her voice patient and encouraging as she explained each step. Mia followed along, her small fingers working carefully with the paper. When her hands trembled with frustration at a particularly difficult fold, Nora gently covered them with her own. "It's okay to start over," she said softly. "Even 10 times. Each attempt teaches us something new." Ethan watched from across the garden, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. The sight of them together, Nora's gentle guidance and Mia's determined focus, painted a picture of healing he hadn't realized he'd been longing to see. As evening approached and Nora prepared to leave, the garden held a different energy than when she'd arrived. The newly planted lilies stood in neat rows, promise contained in their buried bulbs, and a complex crane with multiple wings sat proudly on the table, evidence of Mia's persistence. Later that night, after Mia had gone to bed, Ethan found himself drawn back to the garden. The lanterns cast their warm glow across the paths, and crickets sang their evening symphony. On the garden bench, something caught his eye. A paper crane unlike any he'd seen before. It was made from 2 different papers stitched carefully together. One half shimmering gold, the other a soft lavender. The stitches were tiny and precise, joining the 2 colors in a seamless blend. When he carefully unfolded it, a message was written inside in neat, steady handwriting. "I never thought I'd feel safe around strangers again, but you both feel like home." With careful hands, Ethan carried the stitched crane to the center of the garden, where the newly planted lilies waited beneath the soil. He placed it gently among the hanging lanterns, where it caught the light and seemed to glow from within. Looking back toward the house, he could see Mia and Nora through the window, seated at the kitchen table. They were folding paper together, their movements synchronized in the warm lantern light that danced across the glass. The sight stirred something deep within him, and for the first time in years, Ethan smiled without guilt. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethan stirred from sleep, roused by an unexpected sound floating through his open window. Laughter, soft and melodious, drifted up from the garden below. He blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sound in their usually quiet home. Moving to the window, he pulled back the curtain. The sight below made him pause, his hand still gripping the fabric. Nora and Mia were already in the garden, huddled together near the stone wall. They were surrounded by what looked like hundreds of paper cranes, their delicate forms catching the early morning light. Mia sat in her wheelchair, leaning forward with excitement as she directed Nora where to place each crane. Nora knelt beside her, carefully arranging the paper birds in cascading rows along the garden wall. They were creating what appeared to be a waterfall of cranes, the paper birds seeming to flow down the stone like frozen water. "A little more to the left," Mia instructed, her small hands gesturing enthusiastically. "We want them to look like they're really flying." Nora adjusted the crane's position, her movements careful and deliberate. Like this. Perfect. Mia's laugh rang out again, clear and bright in the morning air. Ethan dressed quickly and made his way down to join them. As he approached, he could see the intricate work they'd already accomplished. The cranes were arranged in a graceful descent, each one positioned slightly different from its neighbors to create the illusion of movement. "Good morning," Nora greeted him, looking up from her work. Her eyes were bright with enthusiasm, and a few strands of hair had escaped her usually neat bun. "We hope we didn't wake you." "We're making a crane waterfall," Mia explained proudly. "Nora says it's like a symbol of how feelings can flow instead of getting stuck." The three spent the rest of the morning working together in the garden. Ethan spread his architectural drawings across a wooden table, sketching new pathways that would accommodate Mia's wheelchair while maintaining the garden's natural flow. His pencil moved with certainty for the first time in years, mapping out gentle curves and wide turns. Nora moved between the table and various sections of the garden, offering suggestions that merged beauty with functionality. "What if we added wind chimes here?" she suggested, pointing to a quiet corner. "The sound can be grounding for people who feel overwhelmed. And these plants," she touched a patch of lamb's ear, "their texture can be very soothing to touch." Ethan nodded, adding notes to his drawings. He watched as she moved through the space, noting how she seemed to consider every element from multiple perspectives, both as a therapist and as someone who understood firsthand the need for safe spaces. "We need a crane nest," Mia announced suddenly, wheeling over to a secluded alcove near the new waterfall. "Right here, for kids who need somewhere to sit with their feelings." Ethan and Nora exchanged glances, both touched by the simple wisdom in Mia's words. "That's a wonderful idea," Nora said, kneeling beside Mia's wheelchair. "We could create a soft seating area, maybe with cushions and low lighting. Sometimes the hardest emotions need the gentlest spaces." As the day progressed, the garden began to transform. Ethan marked out the new pathways with string, while Nora and Mia continued arranging cranes and planning the sensory elements. The air was filled with the gentle tinkling of wind chimes as they tested different locations, finding the perfect spots where the breeze would catch them just right. By early afternoon, Mia's energy began to wane. Ethan noticed her stifling a yawn and suggested she take a rest. He helped her inside for a nap, making sure she was comfortable before returning to the garden. He found Nora sitting on one of the newly placed benches, her eyes closed as she listened to the wind chimes. She opened them as he approached, offering a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me be part of this." Ethan sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "You've brought something special here. I can see it in Mia's face." Nora's fingers traced the edge of the bench, her expression thoughtful. "I haven't shared space with a family in years," she admitted. "After what happened, I kept everyone at arm's length. It felt safer that way." She paused, listening to the gentle symphony of chimes above them. "I forgot how good stillness can feel when someone else is breathing beside you." The honesty in her words touched something deep in Ethan's chest. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light play through the leaves and listening to the quiet music of the garden. When Mia woke from her nap, they decided to have dinner in the garden. Ethan brought out simple fare, sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade, and they sat at the old wooden table, now cleared of architectural drawings. The evening air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of newly turned earth and fresh herbs. Nora was in the middle of telling a story about a particularly determined young client who had insisted on folding all 1,000 cranes in a single day. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, painting pictures in the air. "He made it to crane number 47 before falling asleep face first in the paper pile," she laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Mia giggled around a bite of sandwich, then turned to look at her father. Her next question came with the direct simplicity that children often possess. "Do you like her?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Ethan glanced at Nora, who was still smiling from her story. Her hands paused mid-gesture. The lantern light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and something warm settled in his chest as he watched her. A soft smile spread across his face, genuine and unguarded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do." The next morning arrived with a whisper of autumn in the air. A crisp breeze rustled through the garden, sending fallen leaves dancing across the newly cleared paths. Ethan watched from the kitchen window as Mia and Nora worked together, gathering leaves into neat piles. The scene was peaceful, almost picture-perfect, until it wasn't. Mia's sudden wince caught his eye. Her small hand flew to her side, gripping tightly as she hunched forward in her wheelchair. Ethan's heart jumped, but before he could rush outside, he saw Nora already kneeling beside Mia, her presence calm and steady. "Just a cramp," Mia insisted, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "From sitting too long, maybe." Nora's expression remained neutral, though her eyes held a flicker of concern. She didn't press the issue, instead suggesting they take a break from leaf collecting. "These piles aren't going anywhere," she said lightly, adjusting Mia's blanket against the morning chill. Later that morning, Ethan and Nora prepared for their trip into town. They needed to look at materials for the gazebo Mia had been dreaming about, a wooden structure with wide entrances and smooth ramps, where she could sit and watch the garden grow around her. "We won't be gone long," Ethan promised Mia, who sat at the kitchen table with her origami paper. Mrs. Chen, their regular nurse, had arrived to stay with her. "Take your time," Mia said softly, her fingers moving slower than usual across the colored paper. "Bring back something pretty for the gazebo." The drive into town was peaceful. Nora sat beside Ethan in comfortable silence, watching the countryside roll past their window. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the world in subtle shades of gold and amber. At the lumberyard, they spent time examining different woods, discussing weather resistance and accessibility. Nora's practical knowledge of therapeutic spaces added depth to Ethan's architectural vision. They chose cedar for its durability and natural beauty, and picked out special non-slip flooring that would work well with Mia's wheelchair. It was on the drive back that something shifted. They had stopped at a small cafe for coffee, and as they pulled back onto the main road, Nora began to speak. Her voice was quiet, almost meditative. "You know, my apartment used to feel like a prison," she said, watching the trees blur past. "After the incident, silence became this heavy thing. It would sit on my chest at night, make it hard to breathe. I'd turn on every light, play music constantly, anything to fill the emptiness." Ethan kept his eyes on the road but listened intently, giving her the space to continue. "But here, with you and Mia," she paused, running her finger along the rim of her coffee cup. "The silence feels different. It's not empty anymore. It's more like peace, like finally being able to take a full breath after holding it for years." When they returned to the estate, something felt off. They found Mia at the kitchen table, her untouched lunch sitting beside a scatter of origami paper. She was folding with unusual intensity, her movements sharp and jerky. "Not hungry, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice light. Mia shook her head, not looking up from her work. "Just tired," she mumbled. The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan and Nora unpacked their purchases and discussed plans for the gazebo, but their eyes kept drifting to Mia, who remained unusually quiet at her table. When bedtime came, Ethan helped Mia change into her pajamas and lifted her gently into bed. As he pulled up her covers, he noticed 3 cranes lying in her lap. They were different from her usual careful creations. These were bent at odd angles, their wings twisted and uneven. Something about their distorted shapes made his stomach tighten. "Everything okay, kiddo?" he asked softly, picking up one of the cranes. "Just didn't fold them right," Mia said, turning her face toward the window. "I'll try again tomorrow." After kissing her goodnight, Ethan stood in the hallway for a long moment, the bent crane still in his hand. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Sleep eluded him that night. After hours of tossing and turning, he got up and walked down to the garden. The autumn air was cool against his skin, and the moon cast long shadows through the trees. He wasn't entirely surprised to find Nora already there, sitting beneath the blossom tree. She had wrapped herself in a thick cardigan, and her face was turned up toward the stars peeking through the branches. She looked over as he approached, her expression soft in the moonlight. "Would it scare you if this wasn't temporary?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the night air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lowered himself to sit beside her on the wooden bench, their shoulders brushing lightly. The contact was small but deliberate, an answer of its own kind. The morning sun had barely risen when Ethan's phone rang, shattering the quiet of his home office. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the school's number flash across the screen. The secretary's voice was calm but urgent as she explained that Mia had collapsed during music class. "She's conscious now," the secretary assured him, "but very weak. The nurse is with her." Ethan's hands trembled as he grabbed his keys. He called Nora quickly, leaving a brief message about where he was going, then rushed to his car. The drive to school felt endless, though it was only 15 minutes. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. When he arrived at the nurse's office, Mia was lying on a small cot, her face ashen against the white pillow. Her wheelchair sat empty beside her. Despite her pallor, she managed a weak smile when she saw him. "I didn't want to miss garden day," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. She'd been hiding her symptoms, trying to stay strong for their plans. "Oh, sweetheart," he breathed, kneeling beside her. He brushed back her dark hair, noticing how warm her forehead felt. The school nurse stood nearby, clipboard in hand, explaining that Mia's temperature had spiked suddenly during class. Ethan gathered Mia in his arms, careful not to jostle her. She felt lighter somehow, more fragile. As he carried her to the car, she pressed her face against his shoulder, a gesture that reminded him painfully of when she was smaller, when Eliza was still alive. The emergency room was busy, but Mia's condition and medical history fast-tracked them through triage. Doctors ordered immediate tests, drawing blood and checking her vital signs. Ethan answered their questions mechanically, his voice steady even as his hands shook. It was during the physical examination that they found it, a small, angry-looking pressure sore near her spine. The doctor's expression grew serious as she explained the possibility of infection spreading from the wound. "How did I miss this?" Ethan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. He should have noticed during her baths, during changes. He should have been more careful, more attentive. The hours blurred together in a parade of tests, doctors, and nurses. Ethan remained planted in the chair beside Mia's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. She drifted in and out of sleep, occasionally squeezing his hand or asking for water. He barely registered the passing time until a soft knock at the door drew his attention. Nora stood in the doorway, carrying a canvas bag that bulged with books and snacks. Her face showed concern, but her presence brought a steadiness to the sterile room. "I brought your favorite stories," she told Mia softly, setting the bag down. "And those special crackers you like." She moved with quiet efficiency, arranging things on the bedside table, adjusting Mia's pillow with gentle hands. Mia managed a small smile. "Will you read to me later?" she asked, her voice scratchy. "Of course, sweetheart. Try to rest now." As Mia dozed off again, Nora touched Ethan's shoulder lightly. "Come on," she said quietly. "You need to stretch your legs. Just for a minute." Reluctantly, Ethan followed her into the corridor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the walls, making everything feel slightly unreal. They walked in silence until they reached a quiet corner near a window. "The doctors say it's my fault," Ethan said suddenly, his voice rough. "I should have checked more carefully. Should have noticed something was wrong." Nora turned to face him, her expression gentle but firm. "She's strong because of you," she said softly. "But she's not invincible. None of us are." Something in her words, the simple truth of them perhaps, broke through the wall he'd built around his emotions. His shoulders began to shake, and tears he'd held back for years finally spilled over. Nora didn't speak, didn't try to fix anything. She simply took his hand in hers and held it, offering silent support as he let himself feel the weight of everything. They stood like that for several minutes until Ethan's breathing steadied. When he finally straightened up, Nora squeezed his hand once before letting go. Back in Mia's room, they found her sleeping peacefully, the IV dripping steadily beside her bed. The night settled in slowly, bringing a different kind of quiet to the hospital. Ethan dozed fitfully in his chair while Nora sat cross-legged on the window ledge, her fingers moving methodically as she folded a piece of golden paper. When she finished, she placed the crane carefully on the windowsill. Beneath it, she left a small note written in her neat handwriting. Hope folds quietly, but it never breaks. The hospital room had become their world over the past 3 days. Ethan watched the sun rise and set through the small window, marking time only by the nurses' shift changes and the regular beeping of monitors. Mia slept more than she was awake, her small body fighting the infection that had taken hold. The antibiotics dripped steadily through her IV, but recovery was slower than anyone had hoped. Ethan barely left the uncomfortable chair beside her bed. He dozed in short bursts, startling awake at every change in Mia's breathing or machine tone. His suit jacket hung wrinkled on the back of the chair, his tie long discarded. The nurses brought him coffee and gentle suggestions to go home and rest, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Through it all, Nora came and went like a quiet guardian angel. She brought fresh clothes, decent food, and most importantly, her steady presence. She read to Mia during the girls' wakeful periods, her voice soft and soothing as she shared stories about brave children and magical gardens. Back at the estate, the living lanterns sat untended. The lanterns that had brightened their evenings began to dim one by one as their candles burned down to nothing. The newly planted flowers thirsted for water, and autumn leaves gathered in corners where they'd so recently cleared them away. But Nora couldn't let it fade. Each morning she arrived at the garden before heading to the hospital. She moved through the space with purpose, watering the young plants and sweeping away fallen leaves. The routine became her anchor, a way to feel useful when everything else felt beyond control. Word had spread through the Children's Therapy Center about Mia's condition. Young patients began sending paper cranes, each one carrying messages of hope and healing. Nora hung them carefully among the existing ones, creating a growing tapestry of support. Some were perfectly folded, others charmingly crooked, but each one carried the same pure intention. "Get better soon, Mia. Your cranes taught me to be brave. I hope you feel better. Your garden sounds magical. We're all folding cranes for you." In quiet moments between hanging cranes and tending plants, Nora found herself sitting at the garden bench with her journal. The leather-bound book had been her therapist's suggestion years ago, when words felt too heavy to speak aloud. Now it held her deepest truths, the ones she wasn't ready to voice yet. Her pen moved across the page, hesitant at first, then flowing freely. "I didn't think I could love anyone again, but it's happening. Like breath returning to lungs I forgot I had. It scares me how natural this feels. Being here, caring for this space, loving them both. The garden has become more than just a place. It's becoming my story too, whether I meant it to or not." She closed the journal, tucking it away before anyone could see. These words weren't meant to be shared. They were just her heart spilling onto paper, trying to make sense of the unexpected way life had shifted. On the third evening, Ethan finally succumbed to exhaustion. Mia's fever had broken, and her color was improving. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Nora practically pushed him out the door, promising to stay with Mia while he went home to shower and rest. The drive home felt surreal after so many hours in the hospital. His mind was foggy with fatigue as he pulled up to the estate, but what he saw made him stop short. The living lantern glowed in the early evening light, not a leaf out of place. Fresh candles flickered in the lanterns, casting warm light across the paths. The flowers stood tall and healthy, and new cranes danced in the breeze, dozens of them in all colors and sizes. Ethan walked through the garden in a daze, touching the plants, reading the messages attached to cranes. His throat tightened as he realized how many people were holding space for his daughter, for their family. When he reached the bench, he found a handwritten note weighted down by a small stone. "You don't have to do this alone." He recognized Nora's handwriting, the careful way she formed her letters. The simple message broke something open in his chest, not painfully, but like a flower finally finding sunlight. After a long shower and change of clothes, Ethan sat at his desk. His fingers found a sheet of origami paper, the special gold ones Mia loved so much. With careful movements, he began folding. His crane wasn't perfect like Mia's or graceful like Nora's, but it held everything he couldn't say out loud. The walk back to the hospital felt different. He carried a small bag with clean clothes for Mia, a thermos of the chamomile tea she loved, and his carefully folded crane. The night air was cool against his face, carrying the scent of autumn and possibility. In Mia's room, Nora had dozed off in the chair, one hand still holding a book of fairy tales. Mia slept peacefully, her color noticeably better than when he'd left. The monitors beeped steadily, reassuringly. Ethan placed his crane next to Nora's on the windowsill, where moonlight caught their golden wings. He stood there for a moment, watching his daughter breathe, feeling the presence of both the woman who had left them and the one who had found them. "We're still folding," he whispered into the quiet room. "We're not done." The morning light crept through the hospital room window, casting soft shadows across the sterile walls. Ethan's neck ached from another night spent in the stiff chair beside Mia's bed. His clothes were wrinkled and stubble darkened his jaw. The steady beeping of monitors had become a familiar lullaby over the past 5 days. He shifted in his seat, trying to work out the kinks in his back, when a small sound made him freeze. Mia's eyes fluttered open for the first time in 2 days. Her gaze was clear, more focused than it had been since the fever peaked. She looked at him, and the corners of her mouth twitched upward in a weak smile. "You need a haircut," she whispered, her voice scratchy from disuse. The unexpected comment caught him off guard. A laugh burst from his chest, short and rusty, but real. It was the first time he'd laughed since she'd been admitted, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. "That's the first thing you have to say to me?" he asked, leaning forward to smooth her hair back from her forehead. Her skin felt cool under his palm, no trace of the fever that had frightened him so badly. "Someone had to tell you," Mia replied, her smile growing stronger. "You look like a sheepdog." Ethan laughed again, the tension of the past days beginning to crack. He pressed the call button for the nurse, who arrived quickly to check Mia's vitals. The woman's efficient movements were accompanied by an approving smile as she recorded the improvements in Mia's condition. Later that morning, the doctors arrived with their clipboards and cautiously optimistic expressions. They confirmed what the nurses had suspected: the infection was finally under control. The aggressive antibiotics had done their work, bringing down the inflammation around Mia's spine. Her blood work showed marked improvement, and her temperature had stabilized. "She'll need time to recover fully," the lead doctor explained, adjusting his glasses. "We recommend at least 2 weeks of rest at home, with regular monitoring and physical therapy. The pressure sore will need careful attention to prevent any recurrence of infection." Ethan nodded, absorbing the instructions with intense focus. He'd already started mentally rearranging his schedule, planning how to manage Mia's care during recovery. The doctor continued explaining the treatment plan, but Ethan's attention was drawn to movement in the doorway. Nora stood there holding a fresh bouquet of garden flowers and what looked like new origami paper for Mia. She waited quietly until the doctors finished their rounds before entering the room. Her presence brought a sense of calm that Ethan hadn't realized he'd been missing. "The garden sent these," she said softly, placing the flowers in a vase by the window. "The lilies just opened this morning." Mia's face lit up at the sight of the fresh blooms. "They look happy," she observed. "Did you water them every day?" "Twice a day," Nora confirmed, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. "And I talked to them too, just like you showed me." While Mia examined the flowers, Ethan turned to Nora. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for managing everything while I've been away. The garden, the house." He trailed off, unable to fully express his gratitude. Nora shook her head, brushing off his thanks. "It was nothing. The garden needed someone, and I needed somewhere to be useful." But her eyes lingered on his face when he looked away, carrying something deeper than simple friendship or concern. "Mia," Ethan said, reaching for a large envelope he'd been saving. Some people sent you something special while you were sleeping. He carefully emptied the envelope onto her lap. Dozens of paper cranes in every color imaginable, each carrying messages from local children. Mia's eyes widened as she picked them up one by one, handling them as gently as if they were made of glass. She touched each crane with reverent fingers, whispering names to them as if introducing herself. "This one's from Sarah," she murmured, stroking a blue crane with slightly crooked wings. "And Tommy made this red one. Look how hard he tried to make it perfect." Her face grew thoughtful as she arranged the cranes in a circle on her blanket. "We should build them a home in the garden," she said suddenly. "A real one. Not just hanging them up. They need somewhere special to live." Ethan watched his daughter's face animate with purpose, recognizing the familiar spark of creativity that reminded him so much of Eliza. "What kind of home?" he asked. "A crane sanctuary," Mia replied, as if it were obvious. "With little perches and protected spaces where they can watch over people who need them, like guardian angels, but made of paper." That evening, after Mia had fallen asleep and Nora had gone home, Ethan drove back to the estate. The night air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and late-blooming flowers. He walked through the garden slowly, taking in all the changes. The living lantern was transformed from the neglected space it had been just days ago. The paths were neat and clean, the plants thriving under Nora's careful attention. New lanterns glowed softly, replacing the ones that had burned out. The wind chimes Eliza had chosen years ago tinkled gently in the evening breeze. Near the entrance, something caught his eye. A cluster of white lilies swayed in the darkness, Eliza's favorite variety, the ones she'd always meant to plant but never had the chance. Nora must have found them, must have known somehow they belonged here. Ethan knelt beside the flowers, running his hand through the rich soil. The earth felt alive under his fingers, full of possibility and growth. In this moment, surrounded by the garden's gentle magic and the evidence of such careful tending, something shifted in his heart. "I'm ready now," he said aloud for the first time, the words carrying both weight and relief into the quiet night. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Ethan's car pulled up to the estate. Mia sat in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the window as they approached the familiar iron gates. Her eyes lit up at the sight of Nora standing on the front steps, a thick blanket draped over her arms and a gentle smile on her face. "Welcome home," Nora called out as Ethan helped Mia into her wheelchair. The rich aroma of homemade soup drifted from the open doorway, warming the crisp afternoon air. Mia's face broke into a wide grin as Ethan wheeled her up the ramp they'd installed last spring. Without hesitation, she reached out and wrapped her arms around Nora's waist, pressing her face into the soft fabric of her sweater. "We saved your corner for crane folding," Mia mumbled into the embrace. "Nobody's allowed to sit there but you." Nora's eyes met Ethan's over Mia's head, something unspoken passing between them. She smoothed Mia's hair with a gentle hand. "I brought your favorite blanket from the garden bench," she said. "The blue one with the clouds on it." Inside, the house felt different than when they'd left for the hospital nearly a week ago. Fresh flowers brightened every windowsill, and the musty stillness had been replaced with the comforting scent of herbs and cooking. Nora had opened all the curtains, letting natural light pour into rooms that had been dim for too long. After settling Mia in her room for a much-needed rest, Ethan found himself in the kitchen with Nora. She moved around the space with familiar ease, stirring the soup and pulling down bowls as if she'd always belonged there. The afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting warm shadows across the worn wooden table where they sat. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, watching her hands wrap around a steaming mug of tea. "For all of this. For making it feel like home again." Nora's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "I should thank you," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Being here, it's helped me face things I've been avoiding for years." She paused, taking a careful sip of tea before continuing. "Did you know I once spent 93 days without leaving my apartment? Not even to check the mail?" Her words carried no shame, just a simple statement of fact. After the assault, the world felt too big, too unpredictable. My apartment became my entire universe. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his presence offering silent support as she continued. I counted every day, she admitted. Marked them on my calendar in red ink. 93 days of watching life happen through my windows, of ordering groceries online and pretending I was just too busy to go out. A small smile touched her lips. My therapist finally got me to step onto my balcony on day 94. It felt like standing on the edge of the world. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes clear and direct. The day I came here, when I saw your gate, I almost turned around. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold Mia's crane. Her voice softened. But something about the lanterns in your garden, they reminded me of the nightlights my mother used to put in my room, like little beacons saying it was safe to come home. Before Ethan could respond, they heard Mia calling from her room. Her voice was sleepy but insistent. Dad, can we go outside? They found her sitting up in bed, her hair tousled from her nap. I want to see the garden, she said. Please? Ethan exchanged a glance with Nora, who nodded encouragingly. Just for a little while, he agreed, bending down to lift his daughter. She felt lighter in his arms than she had before the hospital, more fragile, but her smile was as bright as ever. The three made their way to the garden where the late afternoon sun painted everything in soft gold. The blossom tree's branches swayed gently overhead as Ethan settled Mia between himself and Nora on the old wooden bench. The wind chimes tinkled softly, a melody that seemed to speak of memory and possibility all at once. Mia leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her eyes following the dance of leaves above them. I had dreams about Mom in the hospital, she said suddenly, her voice clear in the quiet garden. She was here in the garden with us. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, but he kept his voice steady. What was she doing? Just watching, Mia replied simply. From the wind. She looked happy, like she knew something good was happening. She turned her face toward Nora. She was smiling at you too. Nora's hand found Mia's, squeezing gently. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the hanging paper cranes. Later, after Mia had been tucked into bed with promises of garden time tomorrow, Ethan walked Nora to her car. The gravel crunched softly under their feet, and the evening air carried the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine. The motion sensor lights cast a soft glow over the driveway, illuminating their path. At her car door, Ethan paused. The words he'd been holding back all day finally found their way to his lips. If this is more than healing, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. If it's something else, I'm not afraid of it anymore. Nora stood perfectly still for a moment, her keys clutched in her hand. Then, without a word, she took a step forward and leaned in, resting her forehead against his. The simple gesture carried more meaning than any words could have expressed. Trust, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of something deeper growing between them. The autumn morning light filtered through the study windows as Ethan spread out fresh blueprints across his drafting table. The familiar smell of paper and graphite filled the air, mixing with the scent of coffee from the mug Nora had placed beside him earlier. The sound of wheels on hardwood announced Mia's arrival before she appeared in the doorway, clutching a bright purple clipboard and a handful of markers. I brought my design ideas, she announced, rolling up to the table with determination written across her face. Her recovery had gone well over the past week, and her energy was returning in full force. Nora looked up from her laptop where she'd been composing emails to local organizations. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she smiled at Mia. Perfect timing. Your dad was just about to start sketching the sensory garden layout. Ethan pulled up a chair beside his drafting table, creating a space for Mia's wheelchair to fit comfortably. She'd been insistent on attending every planning session for the Living Lanterns transformation, and neither adult had the heart or desire to exclude her. I think, Mia said, uncapping a green marker with authority, we should make all the paths wide enough for two wheelchairs to pass each other, so nobody has to back up or feel stuck. Ethan nodded, already adjusting his measurements. Good thinking, kiddo. What about the bridges? Mia's eyes lit up. Can we really make them look like cranes? We can try, Ethan replied, his pencil moving across the paper in swift, sure strokes. See here? The wings could form the railings, and the neck could arch over the top to create support. Nora moved closer, peering over his shoulder. That's beautiful, she said softly. And the texture of the walking surface could change halfway across, smooth to ribbed, to help visually impaired visitors know where they are. The morning passed in a blur of creative energy. Ethan's drafting table became covered in sketches, winding accessible paths that followed the natural contours of the land, quiet corners designed for sensory retreat, and gathering spaces where groups could sit together or find solitude. Nora worked steadily on her laptop, reaching out to children's organizations, therapy centers, and local businesses. Her emails were careful and passionate, explaining their vision of creating a space where healing didn't feel clinical, where therapy could happen naturally among the flowers and paper cranes. During a break for lunch, Mia pulled out a piece of paper she'd been working on all morning. I wrote something, she said, her voice suddenly shy, for the therapy center. Ethan and Nora sat quietly as she read, Dear friends, I want to tell you about a garden where paper cranes dance with real birds, and where everyone can find a quiet spot when the world gets too loud. My mom loved this garden, and now we're making it bigger so it can love more people back. I want kids like me to feel safe and magic at the same time. Sometimes hospitals and therapy rooms feel scary, but gardens never do. Every flower here has a story, and every path leads somewhere special. We're building bridges shaped like cranes because cranes mean hope and healing. My mom taught me that before she died. Now I fold them to remember her, and to remind myself that broken things can fly again. Will you help us make this garden a place where everyone belongs? Love, Mia. Silence filled the room after she finished reading. Ethan blinked rapidly, and Nora reached over to squeeze his hand beneath the table. That's perfect, Nora said finally, her voice thick with emotion. That's exactly what we're trying to create. They worked through the afternoon, Ethan refining his designs while Nora drafted proposals. Mia coded different areas of the garden on her own copy of the blueprint, creating a key that marked spaces for thinking and feeling and being brave. As dusk approached, Nora closed her laptop and stretched. Should we take a walk? See how the finished section looks in the evening light? The back portion of the garden had been completed over the past week, a test run for their larger vision. Ethan helped Mia into her jacket, and the three made their way outside. The autumn air was crisp but not cold. Solar-powered lanterns were beginning to glow along the newly laid paths, creating pools of warm light in the growing darkness. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, and the paper cranes hanging from the trees cast dancing shadows on the ground. Mia rolled slowly along the smooth path, running her hands over the different textured sections they'd installed. She stopped beneath the blossom tree, now strung with tiny lights that mimicked stars. Mom would love it, she said simply, looking up at the branches above them. Ethan knelt beside her wheelchair, his hand finding hers. She'd love how much of her is still here, he replied softly. In the flowers she planted, in the wind chimes she chose. He glanced at the paper cranes swaying gently overhead. In the things you make to remember her. They continued their walk, Mia pointing out her favorite spots, the new bench with extra space for wheelchairs, the sensory wall with different textures to touch, the small fountain whose gentle bubbling helped mask outside noises. As they completed their circuit, Mia announced she was tired and ready for bed. Ethan helped her inside, got her settled, and returned to find Nora standing beneath the lantern tree, her face tilted up to watch the play of light through the branches. He approached quietly, not wanting to break the peaceful moment. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, a soft smile crossing her face. The lantern light cast a warm glow around her, making her seem to glow from within. Without words, Ethan stepped closer. Nora's hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. The garden seemed to hold its breath as he leaned in, slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted. She didn't. Their first kiss was gentle, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had grown between them over the past months. There was no desperation, no rush, just the sweet certainty of something that had been earned through shared moments, shared pain, and shared healing. When they finally pulled apart, the lanterns swayed above them, casting patterns of light and shadow across their faces. Neither spoke immediately, letting the moment settle like a butterfly coming to rest on a flower. The announcement spread through the community like a gentle breeze, carrying whispers of hope and healing. The Garden of Paper Cranes, a sanctuary for healing and hope, read the simple yet elegant signs that now mark the entrance to the living lantern. Local newspapers picked up the story, featuring photographs of the transformed space with its winding, accessible paths and delicate paper cranes dancing in the sunlight. Within days, emails and phone calls began flooding in. People from all walks of life reached out, eager to volunteer their time and skills. Therapists offered their services, artists wanted to contribute installations, and gardeners pledged to help maintain the grounds. Each message carried its own story of healing or loss, of hope or searching. Ethan sat at his desk one morning, sifting through the applications with quiet amazement. Nora leaned against the doorframe, watching him with a soft smile. "I think we've touched something deeper than we realized," she said, moving to stand behind his chair. "People aren't just volunteering, they're sharing their stories." He nodded, holding up one particular letter. "This woman lost her son last year. She wants to teach origami classes in his memory." His voice caught slightly. "Says folding helps her hands stay busy when grief gets too loud." Construction began in earnest as autumn deepened. The garden came alive with careful activity, workers laying smooth paths, craftsmen installing benches with space for wheelchairs, artists creating sensory walls with different textures and sounds. Through it all, Mia rolled around in her wheelchair, supervising with clipboard in hand. One morning, she called everyone to gather near a quiet corner of the garden. "This," she announced with authority, "is going to be the Whisper Field." She pointed to the space where wind chimes already hung from low branches. "We'll hang cranes here too, and people can leave notes inside them, about being scared or happy or healing." Nora knelt beside her wheelchair. "What made you think of that?" Mia's eyes grew distant for a moment. "Sometimes you need to tell secrets to the wind because people aren't ready to hear them yet." The idea took root immediately. Within days, the Whisper Field became a favorite spot for visitors. Wind chimes of various tones created a gentle symphony, while paper cranes in every color imaginable danced between them. Small notes appeared inside the cranes, some expressing fear, others joy, many simply saying, "Thank you." Nora began holding weekly workshops on therapeutic folding, teaching visitors how papercraft could anchor them during anxiety or panic attacks. She shared her own story openly now, explaining how origami had helped her find her way back to the world after trauma. "The paper remembers every fold," she would tell her groups, "just like our bodies remember every wound. But look how beautiful it becomes, even with all those creases and bends." Ethan, too, found himself speaking more. He gave short talks about design and recovery, explaining how architecture could create spaces of healing. He spoke about losing Eliza, about raising Mia, about learning to build beauty from broken pieces. One quiet afternoon, Mia noticed a young boy in a wheelchair hovering near the garden's entrance. His mother stood behind him, uncertain. Mia rolled over immediately. "I'm Mia," she said simply. "Want a tour?" The boy, Alex, nodded shyly. His mother started to follow, but Mia gave her a reassuring smile. "We'll be okay. There are benches by the fountain if you want to rest." Mia led Alex through the garden, pointing out her favorite spots. She showed him the sensory wall where different textures created patterns you could feel with your eyes closed. She demonstrated how the paths were wide enough for 2 wheelchairs to pass easily, so nobody ever feels stuck. In the Whisper Field, she pulled out a sheet of origami paper from her pocket. "Want to learn how to fold a crane?" Alex watched intently as she demonstrated each fold, his fingers following her movements carefully. When his first attempt came out slightly lopsided, she smiled. "Perfect. The wobbly ones are the best at carrying wishes." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, folding together under the wind chimes. Finally, Alex spoke softly. I feel normal here. Mia looked up from her paper. You don't have to be normal, she replied gently. Just here. Alex's crane joined the others in the whisper field, carrying a note only the wind would read. As evening approached and the last visitors left, Nora found herself drawn to the blossom tree. The solar-powered lanterns were beginning to glow, casting warm light through the branches. Paper cranes swayed gently overhead, their shadows dancing on the ground. She heard Ethan's footsteps approaching but didn't turn around. His presence had become familiar, comforting, like the sound of pages turning in a favorite book. You know, she said quietly, still gazing up at the illuminated branches, I was never meant to stay this long. The words carried the weight of her past, the fear of permanence, the habit of leaving before being left. Ethan moved to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. Neither was I, he replied softly, but I'm staying anyway. Their hands found each other in the growing darkness, fingers intertwining with the ease of practice. Above them, the lanterns glowed like earthbound stars, and the wind chimes sang their gentle song. They made no promises, spoke no vows. They simply stood together, present in the moment, while the garden held them in its peaceful embrace. Dawn broke over the garden of paper cranes with a gentle stillness that felt almost sacred. Dew sparkled on newly laid paths, and early morning light filtered through thousands of paper cranes, casting rainbow-colored shadows across the ground. Volunteers moved quietly through the space, hanging the final lanterns and adjusting wind chimes with careful precision. The garden had transformed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Winding, accessible paths curved through themed sections, their surfaces smooth and wide enough for wheelchairs to pass easily. Crane-shaped arches marked transitions between spaces, their graceful forms seeming to take flight against the morning sky. The sensory gardens bloomed with carefully chosen plants, soft lamb's ear, fragrant lavender, rustling ornamental grasses that whispered in the breeze. Mia's whisper field had become the heart of the sanctuary. Wind chimes of varying tones created a gentle symphony, while paper cranes in every color imaginable danced between them. Small meditation benches nestled in quiet corners, and texture walls invited touching hands to explore their patterns. Ethan stood at the entrance, checking last-minute details against his clipboard. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of what they'd created. Nora worked alongside the volunteers, arranging fresh flowers and ensuring each space felt welcoming. Her movements were sure now, confident in this place that had become home. As the morning progressed, the first guests began to arrive. Families with children in wheelchairs made their way along the accessible paths, their faces lighting up at the careful thought put into every detail. Trauma survivors walked slowly through the garden, some alone, others accompanied by therapists who had helped them through their darkest days. Teachers arrived with notebooks, already imagining how to incorporate the space into their healing work. Paper cranes seemed to float everywhere. They hung in cascading curtains from tree branches, bobbed gently in shallow reflection pools, and perched on benches like waiting friends. Each one carried wishes, prayers, or simple messages of hope written by community members during the garden's construction. A small ensemble had set up near the blossom tree, their gentle music weaving through the space like another layer of peace. The musicians played softly, classical pieces mixed with gentle contemporary songs, creating a soundtrack that somehow matched the garden's spirit perfectly. When it came time for the official opening, Ethan kept his remarks brief. He stood before the gathered crowd, his voice steady but touched with emotion. "This place," he said, gesturing to the garden around them, "is not about words. It's about what lives in between them, in the spaces where grief meets hope, where broken pieces become foundation stones, where silence can speak louder than any speech." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. The Garden of Paper Cranes isn't just a memorial or a therapy space. It's a reminder that healing doesn't happen alone. It happens in community, in the quiet moments between breaths, in the gentle act of folding paper into wings. The crowd applauded softly, many wiping tears from their eyes. Then Mia's wheelchair was carefully lifted onto the small stage beneath the blossom tree. She looked tiny there, but her presence filled the space. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a piece of paper, but her voice rang out clear and true. "This garden was my mom's dream," she began, looking up at the paper cranes dancing overhead. "She loved making things grow. She taught me that gardens are like people. They need love and time and patience." She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the crowd. "But now it's my dream too. Because dreams grow when you plant them with people who stay." The silence that followed her words was profound. Parents held their children closer. Therapists reached for tissues. Even the musicians dabbed at their eyes. Mia's simple truth had touched something deep in everyone present. As guests began exploring the garden in earnest, Ethan found himself standing alone, watching Mia talk animatedly to a group of children near the sensory wall. She was showing them how to fold simple cranes, her wheelchair positioned so everyone could see her hands clearly. The children leaned in, eager to learn, their own wheelchairs and crutches forgotten in the moment of creation. Nora appeared beside him silently, her presence as natural as breathing. Without looking away from Mia, Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. It wasn't the kind that typically held rings. It was slightly larger, more square. "I don't need to ask a question," he said softly, opening the box to reveal its contents. Inside lay a single crane, folded from gold foil paper. But this wasn't ordinary paper. It was a blueprint of the garden, carefully transformed into wings and hope. Every line of the design was visible in the metallic surface, creating a map of their journey together. "I just want you to have this." Nora closed the box gently, then wrapped her arms around him. They stood there, holding each other, as the lanterns swayed overhead in the morning breeze. And in that moment, carried on the wind that rustled through the paper cranes, they both swore they heard Eliza laughing. Not a sad sound, but one full of joy and approval, as if she too had been waiting for this moment. A gentle morning mist hung over the garden of paper cranes as the sun rose on another day. It had been nearly a week since the grand opening, and already the sanctuary had taken on a life of its own. The paths that Ethan had so carefully designed now carried countless footsteps, each person bringing their own story to add to the garden's growing legacy. Children arrived daily, some in wheelchairs like Mia's, others walking but carrying invisible burdens that seemed lighter within these gates. They gathered in small groups around the sensory gardens, their hands exploring textures and their faces lighting up at new discoveries. The sound of their laughter mixed with the gentle tinkling of wind chimes, creating a symphony of healing that filled the air. Therapists had begun holding regular sessions beneath the shade of ancient trees. They sat with their clients on comfortable benches, folding paper while talking through trauma and triumph. The repetitive motion of creasing paper seemed to unlock something in people, making it easier to speak about difficult things when their hands were busy creating beauty. The whisper field had become a testament to human resilience. New cranes appeared daily, each one carrying messages of hope, fear, love, or loss. Some bore simple words like, "I survived," or "Thank you." Others held longer stories, carefully folded into wings and set free among the branches. Visitors would often stand quietly in this space, reading the notes and adding their own to the collection. Near the reflection pool, a group of art therapy students sketched the way sunlight played through the hanging cranes, their pencils capturing the dance of shadow and light. A young boy in a wheelchair worked intently on his drawing. His tongue stuck out in concentration as he tried to capture the exact way the paper birds seemed to float in midair. The garden staff had developed a gentle routine of maintaining the space without disturbing its peaceful atmosphere. They moved quietly through the paths each morning, replacing any damaged cranes, tidying the meditation areas, and ensuring the adaptive equipment remained in perfect working order. They had come to understand that they weren't just maintaining a garden, they were tending to a living sanctuary of hope. On this particular afternoon, Ethan and Nora sat together on their favorite bench beneath the blossom tree. The spot had become their unofficial meeting place, where they could observe the garden's daily life while staying slightly apart from it. The wooden seat had worn smooth from use, and the tree's branches spread above them like a protective canopy. They watched as Mia worked with another child in her wheelchair, demonstrating the intricate folds needed to create a double-winged crane. Her hands moved with practiced confidence as she showed the young girl how to crease the paper just so, creating extra layers that would catch the wind. The girl's face glowed with concentration and pride as she followed Mia's instructions. "I used to think everything good had to be lost eventually," Ethan said quietly, his eyes fixed on his daughter. His words carried the weight of years spent guarding against joy, expecting it to slip away like water through cupped hands. Nora turned to look at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Or maybe it just becomes something different," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. She reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, like they'd always been meant to fit together. The truth of her words hung in the air between them. They both knew how loss could transform into something new, how Eliza's garden had become this sanctuary, how their broken pieces had created something whole and beautiful together. The garden itself was proof that endings could become beginnings if you gave them enough time and love. They watched as Mia finished her lesson, both cranes now complete. The girl held hers up to the light, marveling at how the paper caught the sun. Mia beamed with pride, already reaching for more paper to start another one. Later, as afternoon light gilded the garden in gold, Mia approached the blossom tree with a special crane in her hands. This one was made from paper that shimmered with a pearlescent finish, its wings more intricate than her usual designs. She looked up at the highest branch, determination setting her jaw. "I want it to go up there," she said, pointing to where the branch stretched toward the sky. Understanding immediately, Ethan moved to lift her from her wheelchair. His movements were gentle but sure as he raised her up, supporting her weight while she reached toward the branch. Mia stretched carefully, her fingers extending the last few inches needed to secure the crane in place. "This one's for the next person who thinks they're alone," she whispered, her words carried away by the breeze. The crane caught the light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the bark of the tree. As day began its slow fade into evening, the garden prepared for its nightly transformation. One by one, lanterns flickered to life, their warm glow creating pools of golden light along the paths. The paper cranes caught this light and seemed to glow from within, their shadows dancing on the ground below. Ethan, Nora, and Mia began their evening walk, a ritual they'd developed in the days since the opening. They moved slowly, with no destination in mind and no hurry to reach one. Mia's wheelchair rolled smoothly along the accessible paths while Ethan and Nora walked on either side of her, their hands linked in a chain of connection. Above them, thousands of paper cranes shifted gently in the evening breeze. Each one told a story, of pain transformed into beauty, of darkness pierced by light, of love that chose to stay when it could have left. They were more than just folded paper now. They were prayers and promises, hopes and healing, all suspended in the growing darkness like stars brought down to earth. The lantern light caught the edges of each crane, illuminating the careful creases and folds that had turned flat paper into wings. Some were pristine and perfect, while others bore the beautiful imperfections of hands learning to create. Together they formed a canopy of hope, above the three figures moving slowly through the garden, their shadows merging into one as they walked beneath the glowing paper sky. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Mia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Paper Sky. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan and Mia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.